So my name's Heather Moykins, and I'm going to be talking about technology and librarianship, but specifically in youth services. So one of the reasons I really thought this is important because not only is it a trend that is really starting to impact all areas of life, but as a student in the 3+1 program, I'm currently studying information technology alongside libraries and information sciences. So there's three main reasons why I wanted to talk about this. One is I would like to talk about the future of print, the digital divide and kind of what that means for a youth librarian, as well as looking at the internet as a growing information resource. So the relationship to youth services, that I think there's three main points. And so one is that the librarian needs to be able to use technology that enhances the reader experience or the user experience. So rather than chasing after trends or stuff, especially with kids, trends can be good for stuff like when you're doing an event or something, but for long-term buying of technologies or changing how the library functions, you need to think more in the long term what's going to benefit and what's going to be a consistent aid. The second is that youth especially are familiar with visuals and technology more than any other demographic. So as a youth services librarian, you really need to stay on top of it and not necessarily make sure that you're like hip and cool, but that you're not letting time kind of sweep you away. You need to stay on the curve at the forefront and make sure that your services and everything that you're talking about or using in the library is relevant to their lives. And then thirdly, how do we teach youth to navigate information resources? Specifically, how do we teach children to go against the principle of least effort and find credible sources, especially when using the internet, because that is something that is an ongoing problem for children, teens, young adults, and even people entering the workforce. So, I'm going to talk about potential impacts next, specifically in services and resources, collections, and practices. So when thinking about how technology can impact services and resources, we need to consider the changing goals of libraries. So, for example, one of the big technological advances in librarianship and really in the world was the Gutenberg printing press. So before that came around, much of the library's focus was on storage, preservation, and archiving. But because the printing press relieved some of that stress about only having a few copies of something or it being so difficult to reproduce, now librarians can focus on meeting user demand and providing up-to-date, accurate information for them. Another thing that we need to consider, especially with services and resources, is will the library become a technical space? So this is thinking about not only how you need to adapt your resources, like do you have more computers, do you use technology like iPads or other forms of tablets, but also how are those changing and how can you buy technology that'll be the most useful to the organization and consistently stay useful. Secondly, we want to talk about the potential impact in collections. One of the main concerns in libraries and really just bookstores, all of kind of the related industries, print, publishing, is will print endure? And so far we see that despite the rise of ebooks, print is sticking around. And however, a lot of libraries are starting to use services like Overdrive or other applications that allow librarians to buy the rights to a book and have that in circulation through an app. But then another thing they have to think about when you're deciding what do we curate, what goes into the collection, what doesn't, is thinking about commercial libraries like Amazon Kindle or Google Books, because they are just big names and they have insane resources that can be almost impossible to match. So when you're thinking about it as a youth librarian, you need to really understand who you're serving and what they'll be needing or be interested in. And then thirdly, in regards to collections, is how do you provide access to all? And this is a big thing with the digital divide, because when you have print or computers, it's a little easier to be able to provide those to all people since libraries are a free service. However, if you start making all of the collections available online or through an app, how do you ensure that everyone will still be able to access those same resources even if they don't have the money or the capability to have a tablet on hand or have something that can use those apps? Finally, I'd like to talk about how it could potentially influence practices at the library. And there's two main points that I'd like to talk about with this. One is that um, technology totally changes how people understand and how they communicate. And so, for example, a lot of students are more visual learners. So you need to be able to understand how to communicate with them and how to use these new resources to communicate more efficiently with the community. And then secondly, how is the library used? You need to not only think about how to provide the best services for them, but also when it comes to your employees, your volunteers, how do you train them? What types of jobs do you need or not need anymore? These are my works cited, but overall this was just kind of something that I felt is very important to everyone, but especially someone who's going to be an information professional. And as a youth services librarian, you need to be aware of what youth are using, what they're familiar with, and be able to not only help them navigate that, but also provide them with the ability to learn about those technologies and use them without needing to buy them necessarily.